Greetings from the Australian National University here in Canberra to everyone joining us today. Warm welcome to you all. I hope you're all keeping safe and healthy during these strange times. My name is Jay. I look after international relations and partnerships here at the ANU. I'm joined today by my colleague Arthur Xu and of course our speaker for today, Professor Michael Jenions. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional owners of the land and airways that we are broadcasting to you today from, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And now, please let me briefly introduce our speaker for today, Professor Michael Jenions. Michael is currently a professor in the ANU Research School of Biology, where he also heads the Division of Ecology and Evolution. Michael grew up in South Africa, completed his PhD at Oxford University, after which he spent time researching in and traveling through some exotic, picturesque countries. I understand, Michael, you spent time in Trinidad, Barbados, Panama. I'm starting to get a bit jealous, but we get the gist. And then finally arriving into Australia in 2001. Michael's research interests at ANU focus on behavioral and reproductive ecology, where he and his group study fish, crickets, beetles, crabs, and humans. Michael has also held a long-standing interest in meta-analysis. He has received multiple fellowships and grants from the Australian Research Council. There's too many for me to list in this short introduction. And he was also a recipient of a fellowship from the European Institute of Advanced Study. Michael and his research group actively and regularly publish in leading scientific journals and have collaborators all around the world. Michael is as passionate about teaching as he's about research and continues to engage and teach students at the ANU at all levels. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Professor Michael Jenions to tell us more about the economics of evolution. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Jay. Well, the first thing is I noticed one of the questions was, do birds appear near classrooms at ANU? And as you can see, there is a beautiful cockatoo performing for us outside. Oh, and there's another. Fantastic. Yes, the campus here is very beautiful. We have lots of parrots, cockatoos on campus, possums at night. Sometimes there's even kangaroos on campus. So it's a wonderful place. We're very, very lucky to be here. And I hope you get to be here too. So I'm going to turn away from the cockatoos now. We may go back to them if you get bored of me later. So it's a great privilege to be here. And I'm just going to start sharing my screen now. Right. And hopefully, Jay, you can just confirm to me that you can see the full screen there.
It's perfect.
Thank you. And as Jay said, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country. I'm here in Canberra, which is the land and home place of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And I pay my respects equally to elders past, present and emerging. And it's a great privilege to live in such a beautiful place. With these wonderful animals that you saw outside the window and know that it's been looked after for such a long time. Okay, let's get on to the talk. So the title is The Economics of Evolution, Sons and Daughters. And like you, I'm not quite sure what slide comes next because teaching is always a bit of an adventure. And usually when I teach, I try to interact a lot with the class. And one of the things I wanted to do, even though we can't interact here today, is try and give you a flavor of the way that lecturers would teach at the ANU, where I'm trying to get you to answer questions and interact with me so that you're actively learning and not just sitting there while I give you fact after fact, which from my memory was a pretty boring way to learn. If I wanted to do that, I would just read a book. I wanted to interact with my lecturers, and that's something you can do at the ANU. So let's have a wake up. Let's get our brains going. So I'm going to show you something and I'm going to ask you a question. This is not a poll question. Which capital city was named the most violent on the planet? It changes from year to year. The capital city with the highest murder rates. So what do you just have a little think in your heads? Where was it? Maybe which part of the world it was if you can't think of a specific country. So got an idea in your heads? Well, I'm hoping you didn't think it was Canberra, because definitely not. Canberra is a very peaceful, lovely place to be. Beautiful city and countryside right next to each other. So let's see if my cursor is showing up. Let's see if I can just change the presenter pointer options. Yeah, I'm actually there right now. just at the base of this mountain. This is Black Mountain, and the ANU is at the base there. So I'm somewhere there. So it isn't Canberra that's the most violent capital city on the planet. The answer, at least a few years ago, was Caracas. Now, Caracas is, well, where is Caracas? For those of you that are not great with geography, where is it? So let me remind you. There's Caracas. It is at the top of South America. So let me go back. There it is. Now my question for you is, if you were to go due north, if you go due north from Caracas to the top of South America there, where will you land? If you go due north, which of these arrows is best going to show? So this is the pole. So pick arrow number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. What do you think? Let's see. Oh, this is fun to watch. I've never done these polls before. So what I'm seeing is that between 80% of you have picked between 1 and 3. You've all said it's here, right? Now, how confident are you in your answer? That's my question. How confident are you? Pretty confident? Very confident? You're now starting to worry? But you know this. You've looked at the globe. How many times have you seen the map of the world? How many times? So you should know the answer to this one. This is so simple, right? Let's see what the answer is. We can end the poll now, Jay. I'll end that. Share the results. Okay, so basically we had 30, 50, 70, 79, 87% of you picked arrows 1, 2, or 3. Now, here is the answer, and you are going to be shocked. The answer is that I didn't even give you the option. Everything I gave you was too far to the west. The actual reality is that South America and North America are not above each other like you were thinking. You thought, oh, there's South America, there's North America, right? Wrong. In fact, they are like that. And if you had lived in Panama, like I did down here, you would know that Panama actually runs east-west. So that continents are like that. And yet you were pretty confident. Most of you, you said you gave answers that were over here. You were really, really far off the mark. And yet this is something that you should have known the answer to. So what do we learn from this? Well, I think the lesson to learn is that when something seems obvious and correct, that doesn't mean it is. Often we can be wrong. And the reason we're wrong is because we have certain shortcuts in how we think about things, and these can easily mislead us. And I'm going to be talking to you about evolutionary biology today. And this is a field in which people constantly make mistakes because of the way they view the world and the way the world really is. And there's a mismatch between them that leads to the quick answers we give often being incorrect. Or sometimes we get the right answer, but we don't actually know why, which is as good as guessing. If you don't know why it's the answer and you get it right, it doesn't really count. A chimpanzee having 5 buttons to press will press the correct one 20% of the time. Okay, so my name's Michael. In Australia, everyone uses their first name. It's not very formal. I very rarely get called Professor Jennings, except by Jay. Thanks, Jay. Very polite of you. But everyone here uses first names. I grew up in South Africa. I'm very proud to have grown up in South Africa, a wonderful part of the world. I did my PhD in Oxford. I then went to Panama, where I did a postdoc I spent about 5 years there, living actually right in the edge of the rainforest, very beautiful place. And then I moved to the Australian National University here, the Research School of Biology in Australia, in 2001. And that's another bird there, Crimson Rosella. This is another bird that you can very easily see on campus. They often come to that feeder that I had outside there. There'll be Crimson Rosellas there as well. They're very common around here. So I've had a nice international background, and my background is mirrored in a way by the student body at the ANU. And I'll give you an example with my own students. So here are some current and recent students. So we have Upama from Bangladesh, Bob from Australia, Regina from Mexico, Joseph from Taiwan, Ivan from Russia, Lauren, Australia, Yiyang from Taiwan, Rose from Australia, Pierre from Canada, and Maida from the Basque Country. So it's a wonderful place to be because of this international, vibrant community we have. So that is another big asset of coming to the ANU in my view. All right, more diversity. Let's even take it out further. I've worked on a bunch of different species. So these are some of the things I've worked on. And if you like biology, and I guess you do if you're here today, you know how beautiful the natural world is. And I've been very privileged to work on things like these damselflies in South Africa, these beautiful cichlid fish in Panama, and this is another live bearer fish in Panama, zebra finches, unfortunately not in the wild, that was actually in Oxford. These painted reed frogs, Hyperoleus in Zululand in South Africa, fiddler crabs in Panama, and these are actually ones from Darwin. These are the fish I work on nowadays, and I also worked when I first arrived in Australia on crickets. So all kinds of different weird and wonderful things, and I love being involved with research, and my students now do most of the research, but doing empirical research is a big part of what I do and my students do, and it informs my teaching, and there's a good interaction between research and teaching at the ANU. But what I actually want to talk to you about today is a little strange. If I was sensible and smart, I would talk to you about animals and I'd just tell you some fun stories and I'd make you happy that way, and I'd tell you crazy things animals do. But what I'm actually going to do is try and take a risk and, as I say, give you a mini version of a lecture I would give and tell you why I want to talk about theory and deeper things. And it's because I want you to understand everything, not just single case by case. What does this animal do? What does that animal do? I want you to have the deeper understanding of what drives many animals to do things. And that is more powerful in terms of your ability to explain the world. And as an evolutionary biologist, one of the main touchstones, one of the foundations, is this selfish gene view of the world promoted by Richard Dawkins. So what is the purpose of life? When we think about animals, they do so many different things. So here we have honeypot ants on the right-hand side, these ants that hang down from the chamber, inside the chamber, and then provide a source of food for other animals. On the other side of that slide, there was a tunicate. Here we have a tree that lives for 4,000 years. Oh, I'm not sure why this is going forward at speed like this. Let me just go back on it. We have a bird of paradise. So such a great diversity of life. What could tie all these things together? What brings them all together and helps us explain the variety and the characteristics of these different species that we're seeing? And the answer is natural selection. Natural selection is a trial and error kind of process. Basically, new genes emerge. They arise by mutations. You have one gene, and then there's a change in the sequence, the nucleotide sequence, and then you have a new one. And it spreads. Well, why does it spread? Well, it spreads and increases in frequency if its effect on the world, and that depends on its effect on the phenotype of individuals. Phenotype is basically just how you look. So phenotype is a fancy word for how you look. If the gene affects the phenotype in a way that aids propagation, then it's going to be selected for. So naturally selected characters evolve because genes contributing to those characters in the past were more successful than other genes at leaving copies in the present. It's a very simple idea, but so much flows from this. So then we start asking ourselves, well, what kind of phenotypes will we see in the world? Like how will things look? Why do things look the way they do? What kind of phenotype should an organism have to propagate its genes? Because what we can basically think about is we can think about organisms as vehicles for gene propagation. This is a famous quote from Richard Dawkins. We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. I think he might now regret the exact phrasing there, but the point is quite profound and remains true, is that the genes inside me and inside those cockatoos out there, those are the genes that did a good job of making characteristics that allowed that gene to get into more copies in the next generation, in other words, into more other individuals. So as an evolutionary biologist, I'll often say something like, what is the best strategy? Which I mean by what strategy is going to evolve? And by that, I mean which phenotype will maximize the number of copies of a gene that get into future generations. So let me put that in, Let me put that in plain words. So if you think about it, well, you immediately have an intuitive understanding of what I mean. Well, obviously it's good to be able to run fast so you can run away from predators. It's good to be sexy so that you're more likely to attract mates to mate with you. It's good to have a good immune system so you can fight off a disease, whether it be COVID or AIDS or malaria, whatever it might be. You want to be able to fight off diseases. But there's so much more going on than that. And I'm going to talk about a weird one today. So I think it's not weird, it's a basic question about the world, but it's a little bit different than you might be used to thinking about natural selection, where you just think about something like selection for being camouflaged or running fast. And remember, the whole point underlying this is thinking about genes, which genes will make phenotypes, make animals do things or act in certain ways or have certain characters that will then increase the chances that they produce offspring and the genes get into the next generation. So today I'm just going to give a taster of how you'd think about that view of the world, or how you can use that view of the world to think about problems. So my example is going to be all about sex allocation. So there's a rich theory about sex allocation. Sex allocation is the division of resources into males and females. But first, a little bit of, you may never have thought about this, but what is it that makes something male and something female from a biologist's perspective? So in the middle there, we have a kind of fish. And you can see on the right-hand side, this individual is got a large protuberance, a tube, a fleshy tube, which it inserts into, it looks terrible, I know, this is how I lecture, inserts into this other individual there. And then this individual over here then gets pregnant, effectively. So which is the male and which is the female? You might say, oh, I think this is the female. Now, I know a lot of you won't think that because you'll know these are seahorses, and you know that seahorses are quite strange because the males become pregnant. So the female actually has this tube that she inserts into a hole, into an opening in the male's belly, and then she pushes eggs into it, and they're fertilized inside, and then the eggs are fertilized and they develop into little baby seahorses inside the male. So why do we call this individual the male and this individual the female? And the answer is very simple for biologists. It is based on the size of the gametes, the size of the sex cells. If you produce the big sex cells, eggs, you are female. If you produce the small ones, usually many small ones, because you can either make a few big or many small, you are male. So males produce sperm, or if they're plants, pollen. Females produce eggs, ovules. For a biologist, that's how it's done. Of course, in humans, sexuality and gender is more complicated, but the basic idea of biological sex for most biologists remains straightforward. It's the size of the sex cells you produce. So that's the definition. It's relative gamete size. So big egg and tiny sperm makes you male or female. This is just the egg of a Drosophila, very strange looking egg, and these actually are the sperm of a Drosophila. They're huge. In fact, these are all wound up, but if you were to unravel it, like untying your I've usually got my headphones here. If you were like untying your headphone and stretched out that sperm that you can see there, that little ball of stuff, is actually longer than the entire body of the fruit fly, the Drosophila fruit fly. They are ginormous sperm, but still they are smaller than the egg, which is why, despite their size, those individuals are still the males. So sex allocation is dividing resources into males and females. And if you think about it, sometimes an animal or plant can actually be both sexes. It can have the ability to produce both eggs and sperm. So many marine invertebrates, for example, are both male and female. So that leads to an obvious question. If you are both male and female, how should you invest in eggs and sperm? How should you invest in your maleness and femaleness? That's the kind of fun question you can ask as an evolutionary biologist. Here's another one. Sometimes animals change sex. They start out as male and they become female, or they start out as female and become male. So for example, if you know Nemo from Disney, I don't know if Disney would like you to know this, but Nemo would start out when he was little being male, but by the time Nemo gets old and big, he will become female. So then as a biologist, you ask yourself, well, when should you change sex? So remember I talked about strategies, what's the best thing to do? At what point should a fish go, this little fish go from being male to female? What determines the switch point? Can we come up with a theory to explain that? And the answer is yes, we can. I'm not going to tell you about that today. Instead, I'm going to tell you about something so simple that you should care, that you all understand the question straight away, and you will all care about it, and you'll realize that this applies to every single animal that reproduces sexually, whether it's that cockatoo out there, or me here, or the earthworm, or the beetle that you might see later today. The issue of producing sons or daughters. So should you have more sons or more daughters? That's the question. So have a think about that for a second. More sons, more daughters. What do you think the best thing to do is? So I want you, and I can't unfortunately speak to you now, but I wish I could, because I could get some ideas from you, and I know that it would work well because you'd give me some very interesting ideas. Some of them would be maybe right, some of them might be wrong, but now I have to guess as to what you are thinking and carry on. Right, we've got the poll up now. Before we do the poll, just Jay, can you pause the poll for a second? Just stop the poll. And we can relaunch it in a second. Okay, I'm just going to stop the poll for a bit because I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you a little bit because you might have a certain instinctive response. I'm just going to tell you a couple of little things. The first is I want to tell you about the so-called Fisher condition. Now, this is the easiest thing in the world to remember, but it's one of the hardest things to remember to use consistently. I know you won't believe me. So what you need to remember is that everyone has one mother and one father. So there are a few weird species, but basically everyone's got one mom, one dad. And you need to think about that. So this is a question that really motivated a very famous biologist called Sir Ronald Fisher, probably not the nicest of people, but a brilliant biologist and a statistician. So he was thinking about this, and one way you can think about it, in case you might have had an idea in your head as to what you think the answers should be, but let me challenge you with this by giving you a little thought experiment. Why don't you make mainly daughters? Why not do that? And here's why it might be a good idea. Let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine we've got an island with 10 people on it, 10 adults on it. There they are. There are 10 individuals. Now, 5 males, 5 females. Now they can produce 5 sets of babies. 5 females worth of babies. Great. But what if on the island instead we had 9 females and only 1 male? And this male, Jet Li, I'm sure he is perfectly capable. I don't know Jet Li personally, but I'm sure that he is perfectly capable of fertilizing the eggs of 9 females. And then you would end up with 9 sets of babies. So much more successful. So many more genes getting into the next generation from Jet Li here than they are here. So in other words, the population growth is halved if you're producing, say, 50% sons. So now that I've told you that, now what do you think? So now I want you to do the poll. So Jay, if you could launch the poll. Now what do you think? Should you produce sons or daughters? That's the wrong poll, Jay. It's the next poll, poll 2. All right, so let's see what people are saying. So far we have about 50% saying equal, 25% saying more daughters. All right. Just go for a few more seconds, and then we'll. I think we're good now. Okay, let's stop. Let's stop there. So we ended up with about 50% of people, very funny, it's 50%, saying you should produce equal numbers of sons and daughters, and about 13, well, I guess the other 50% saying you should bias it towards sons or daughters. Now, for those of you that, I'm going to tell you the answer in a second, and I think a lot of you will be quite smug. You'll say, oh yes, I got the right answer. But remember what I said earlier, you might have got the right answer, and the right answer here is 50-50. But my question to you is why? Why is that the right answer? Can you actually explain it to me? Or did you just say that because you know that when a friend or family member has a child, it's 50-50 whether it's a son or a daughter? Were you just using humans as your reason for giving that answer? Because I can tell you that out there in the real world, there are animals that produce very biased sex ratios. There are animals where 95% of their offspring are daughters, and there are some where they produce more sons than daughters. So it is not the case that it has to be 50-50. So how are you going to explain it? So one way to explain it is to have this idea of reproductive value. So reproductive value is the expected contribution of an individual in that stage of life, say for example at birth, to lifetime reproductive success. In other words, how many offspring will they go on to produce? So let's look what happens. Let's say you made the decision that you were going to produce more daughters than sons. And let's say everyone else decides to do the same thing. Everyone is producing more daughters than sons. So I've represented it here. Forgive me for it being very stereotyped, but I've made pink the females and blue the males. So we've got twice as many females as males because people are producing twice as many daughters as sons. So what happens? Well, they go off and they have sex. That's my version of sex when they meet up. So let's look at their reproductive value. Well, the reproductive value of the female, let's say it's 1. She has 1 set of offspring. That of a male is 2, because for every female, for every male, there are 2 females. So a male gets to participate in twice as many reproductive events as a female, so they're twice as successful. So if you have sons in this particular case, you're going to get a lot more grandchildren than if you produce daughters. Great. So it seems like, well, make sons. But what now if everyone starts doing that? So now we've got a ratio where there's 2 sons for every daughter. Now what does it look like? Well, now if we go and look again, what happens? Oops. Now the reproductive value, the female still produces a baby. Each female produces a baby, but the sons, they have to share, or one of them misses out. So males, half the males miss out, or they have to share the offspring between them for a given female. So they are only worth half as much. You only get half as many grandchildren from each son as you do from each mother. From each daughter, sorry. So that doesn't work either, because now it makes sense to produce daughters. Daughters have a higher reproductive value. You'll get more grandchildren through daughters. So the only point at which this then becomes stable is when you produce equal numbers of sons and daughters. When there's equal numbers of sons and daughters going into the population, then they have the same reproductive value. Great. Makes sense, I hope? Fantastic. So let's just quickly sum that up. I'm aware of the time ticking on a little bit, Jay, but hopefully it's okay. So here's the argument. Offspring of the rarer sex have more children. So if you have 10 daughters for every 1 son, and everyone does the same, each son has 10 children for every child a daughter has. So sons are 10 times more valuable. And exactly the reverse is true if there are more sons than daughters, because then sons per capita are not involved in as many matings as daughters. So the sexes only have the same reproductive value, they're only worth the same if the birth-sex ratio is 1:1 in this simple example. So how would you test this? So it's kind of a fun idea. So that's a bit of theory. How would you go out into the real world and test this? What would you do? How could you change the world and do an experiment to then see if there is evolution, if natural selection will select for genes that cause the production of equal numbers of sons and daughters? So somehow you've got to make it a world in which they're producing more of one sex than the other, and then see what's going to happen. So someone very cleverly, a guy called David Conover, thought about this, and he thought, well, there are these fish, these are Atlantic silverside, where temperature determines sex. You may have heard about this in things like reptiles, most famously in turtles. So in this particular species, if the water is warmer than average, the young fish develop into males. If it's colder than average, they develop into females. And on average, because they've evolved in water of average temperature, you end up with as many males as females being produced, more or less. So it works out okay. So his experimental design is he took big tanks in the laboratory, very big tanks, and he either made these tanks a lot hotter than usual or a lot colder than usual. And then he saw, how did the sex ratio, how did the sex ratio in the population change over the years, over the generations? So to start with, obviously in the hot tanks, they were male biased, because that's how the sex determination system works. If it's hot, you end up producing males. And if it's cold, you end up developing as a female. But what happened after natural selection started to operate? And this is the very cool bit. Here's what happened. Initially, let's say the hot tank was male biased, but over the generations, it moved back until by 8 generations later, it was back to 50-50. And the same happened in the cold tanks, moving back towards 50-50. In other words, there must have been genetic variation in the temperature at which an individual became male or female. So in the hot tanks, individuals that became female at a hotter temperature were strongly favored. Any gene that caused that to happen would be very strongly favored, because females are rare, so they have this huge advantage. They have much more reproductive value than males. So this is a beautiful illustration of how they were able to experimentally test this idea. Okay, now let's take a break and relax for a second. This is just for me so I can have some coffee. I like this picture here because if you look closely at it, you can see that it is made entirely of things you can eat. It's broccoli and peas and parsley, and if you look right at the back, the mountains there are bread with flour coming off. So I think it's a lovely little piece of edible art. Right, now I'm going to ask you another question to see if your brain has now learned something. So I've given you everything that you need to answer this question. So if you weren't sure about things before, hopefully I've explained why the sex ratio is 1-to-1 at birth in that particular scenario. Now let's see how you can apply this. So I'm going to remind you of 3 things. Firstly, remember, when I say what is the best strategy, I'm asking which phenotype will maximize the number of copies of gene that get into future generations. For sex allocation, in other words, what strategy as a parent, if there's genes that determine whether you produce slightly more sons or more daughters, which variant will lead to the most grandchildren? Second reminder, the Fisher condition. Everyone has one mother and one father. Third reminder, reproductive value. How much success are you going to get from an individual? So if you produce a son, how many offspring will they produce? If you produce a daughter, how many offspring will they produce? So let's take those 3 things. Clearly I can't count. 3 things, and let's see if you can apply them. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you a challenge. So remember, that's how it worked. Don't produce too many females. Don't produce too many males. Produce 1-to-1. Okay, I'm already reminding you to try and be repetitious so that you remember that. Now the question is, have you learnt anything? So what I'm going to ask you now is, what about adult mortality, and what if it differed between males and females? Let's be honest, males are pretty stupid. Sometimes they do very dumb things. We know in humans, young men, once they leave home, they do, they show off and they drive their cars too fast and they try to impress girls and they die at a higher rate. In nature, to make it about biology, often males will invest a lot in trying to grow quickly so that they're bigger than rivals and can outcompete them. there's costs to doing that, and often the mortality rate of males is higher than that of females. So now that you know that, I'm going to ask you, what is the best offspring sex ratio? Remember, by best, I mean what's going to get you the most grandchildren. And you're going to be in a world, I'm going to ask you to think about this world, where firstly, there's no need for parental care. You're a parent, you just have babies. Boom, yay, and off they go. So you don't have to worry about looking after them. So your sons and your daughters cost you as much to look after as each other. The second fact, though, is that your sons have much higher mortality. Sons are more likely to die. So my question is, should you have more or fewer sons? So this is the next poll, Jay, if we can just bring this poll up. Sons are more likely to die. Should you have more or fewer sons, or equal? Your choice. Let's see what you think. And remember, I gave you all the information you needed to solve this problem. I do like teaching this topic. I find it very fun. All right, I think we can end there. So basically about 40% of you said equal numbers of both, and about 37% of you said make more sons, and 17% said make more daughters. Making more daughters also sounds pretty good, right? Because it's like, well, sons are going to die, why bother? Making more sons sounds like a good idea. Well, make more sons because they die and you need to replace the ones that have died. Great. So you all gave answers there. Which is the right answer? And again, remember, if you got the right answer, if you can't tell me why, I'm not impressed. I can predict tossing a coin, it's going to be heads. If it lands heads, I didn't do it. I just got lucky with my guess. So the ability to explain the answer is what I really am looking for here. So what do you think the answer is? All right, I'm just going to stop sharing that and just get the poll off. So a lot of people might have thought, well, you should make more sons because they die, right? So make more sons than daughters, because sons are weak, daughters are strong. That'd be better value for you. But in fact, that's not the right thing to do. What you should do, and when I say what you should do, what evolution will favor are genes that cause you still to produce the same number of sons and daughters. So producing equal sex ratio, 50% sons, 50% daughters. That's what should happen. Great. So if you didn't get that answer, you might be like, oh, why? And if you did get that answer, you go, yay. And then you go, but why? Let me try and explain. Let's go back here. And now we've got 50-50. So this is producing 50% sons, 50% daughters. There's 4 sons, 4 daughters there. I'm going to kill 2 of the sons. So they have high mortality. Half of them died. So they're not going to mate. What happens to the rest? Well, great. What we now see is that the sons that survived were twice as successful as the females, because there were twice as many females left alive as males left alive. So their value, their reproductive value of a son that lives is twice that of a daughter. The problem, however, is that there's only half as many of them. That's why they've got a higher reproductive value, because there's fewer of them. And so they actually perfectly cancel out. The fact that the sons become rare because they're dying is perfectly balanced out then by the fact that there's fewer of them. So as a parent, the total number of grandchildren you get through sons and daughters is the same. Everyone's sons have a high chance of dying, but if your sons are the ones that survive, you get twice as much success from them. So they cancel out. 2 times a half equals 1. So that's the answer there. And I think it's counterintuitive. That's why I showed you that example in the beginning with the map with North and South America and Caracas. It seems obvious what the answer is, but it's not. And in the same way, it seems obvious the answer here to many of you will be, well, make more sons because they die, or make fewer sons because they die. And in fact, the answer is neither of those. It's carry on doing what you were doing before. Make 50-50. This is just summarizing it. I'm not going to go into that in any more detail. Right, looking at the time, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 more slides and then I'm going to end. There is a little hidden assumption in this, and this hidden assumption is where I'm going to try and link what I've been talking about now to something in the real world. The little hidden assumption I had in that example is that you don't know whether your sons will do better or worse than average. You just know it's an average world. But what if you had a little bit of extra information? What if you knew something about your sons versus your daughters? So for example, what if you knew that your sons would do better than the average son, or that your daughters would do better than the average daughter? Now this is quite an important idea, because if you knew that, what you would do is you would make more of that sex, because you've got extra information. So for example, if I knew, this is a silly example, but it's actually a biologically relevant one. If I was a female and I was partnered with a male who was very attractive, very good looking male, he's a star, he's a Bollywood star, he's a Hollywood star, he's a star of the emerging film industry in China, good looking guy. As a woman, I know, well, there's a good chance his sons will be more attractive than average. So they're going to have much higher mating success than average, have more children than average. So what I should do then is bias the sex ratio towards producing more sons. And in nature, there's examples of this, where often what happens is that one sex benefits more from growing up bigger than average, in better body condition. So if as a mother, you're in good body condition, let's say producing sons that are going to end up bigger than usual, it gives them an extra advantage because they win fights. You might then wish to bias the sex ratio towards that particular sex. And that would be great. And if you think about it, when you think about conservation and we're trying to save species that are endangered, like this kakapo, this New Zealand parrot, or the white rhino, if you think back to right at the beginning when I gave you that experiment, or that thought experiment with the island, and I said there were 10 individuals on it, wouldn't it be nice if you could somehow make the parents produce more daughters than sons? Because then you could increase the population growth rate, and we want to grow the population. But at the same time, we've seen that evolution by natural selection is going to oppose that and favor a 50-50 ratio. But the little trick is, if the sex ratio is dependent on extra information, what if we could trick animals into having extra information that makes them think they would do better producing daughters than sons? And this is exactly what happened in kakapo. This is my last story, and then I'm going to end this. In the kakapo, they were keeping them in captivity, feeding them nicely, and they kept producing lots of males, lots of sons. And they were, this is terrible. This is really bad. We need females. We want to grow the population. Then someone who knew about sex allocation theory said, well, maybe what's happening here is that when a female, a mother, is in good condition, she produces sons because there's going to go and be big, healthy sons. So what we should do is put the females on a diet, not feed them so well, and then they are more likely to produce daughters. And that is what they did, and it worked. So they were able to shift the sex ratio from producing mainly sons to producing far fewer sons and an increase in the number of daughters, which was a very important step in aiding with the conservation of this beautiful parrot. So I think that's a really nice example of how this theory can be used in the real world. And I'm going to end there. I could carry on. I've got plenty more, but I know I'm going over time. So I'm going to stop there. Jay, do you want to come back on and let me know if there's a human being on the end of this?
Right. Thank you, Michael. That was very fascinating. There's a few questions now already waiting for you, Michael.
Where do I find them?
In the Q&A box.
Okay, I'll stop share. So we look a little bit bigger in the Q&A box. Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't. I saw there were questions coming in all the time. All right, let me see. I'll go through the answers. Yes, the birds are here.
So,
Evolution is not a goal-driven process. Sorry, I should read out the questions.
or just very quickly, Michael, when you're reading out, if you just click on answer live and just click answered or done once you're done. So, yeah.
Okay, so Darwinian evolutionary theory suggests that evolution is not a goal-driven process. While there might not be a long-term goal associated with the process, the premise of your talk seems to suggest that there would be short-term goals, so to speak, namely the survival of individual organism and its offspring, future offspring. Yeah, it's a little bit like that. I guess the point though is it's a blind process. So Dawkins talked about the blind watchmaker. This is just how it works. If there's two genes and one gene makes body parts or behaviors, codes for body parts or behaviors that increase the likelihood of copies being made, that is what is going to be seen in the world. So the world looks as though there's a goal. So I look as though someone has designed me to have children. Well, I don't know if it's me, maybe not, but makes animals look as though they're designed by God to do that. But the reality is that evolution acting blindly creates that illusion of there being a goal. I think that's my answer. It's a great question. What makes you think that Richard Dawkins may now regret his quote? I think he regrets the quote a little bit because the blind lumbering robots perhaps overemphasizes I don't know, I can't remember exactly why he took this back a little bit, but it sort of overemphasizes the interaction between the gene and the environment as possibly one answer. And that it's not like we have, well, it's a very deep question. Do we have free will? And I think some of you are of a more philosophical bent may realize that it's very hard to know what free will means. If our genes determine a large component of our behavior and the environment around us determines the other bit, where does that leave us room to negotiate? Are we ultimately just fleshy robots that carry out plans that are determined by everything that happened to us in the past, the genes we were born with, the environment in which we grew up? So that's possibly why he might regret the quote a little bit. Does Darwin's theory of natural selection work for all species? I would say yes. It works for any system where you have replication, where you have things being copied and there is variation. The copying is imperfect, so you get new variants arise. Any variant that's better at making copies of itself is going to increase in frequency, and that ultimately is what evolution is all about. It's about differential replication of types. So yes, I think it can work for all species, and it can work for languages, it can work for ideas. Some ideas are better than others. They get picked up, they stick in people's brains, and they live in brains, they live in books, and they increase in frequency. So ideas, in a strange way, Dawkins called them memes, can also evolve. So yes. Hi, very fascinating, thank you. How does this fit well with the idea of female choice in most organisms, especially in organisms where the investment of females in reproduction is higher than that of males? You know, I can't answer that question quickly. All I can tell you is if I was to give you another talk, I would give you a talk asking why do males and females differ, and I would get you, I guarantee you, to give 2 wrong answers as to why females provide more care than males. I guarantee you that with this audience, I would get 2 wrong answers and I would not get the right answer. Or maybe 1 or 2 people would get the right answer. But you're going to have to come to the ANU and take my 3rd year course if you want to know the answer to that. Or you could read online. But yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. But yes, definitely the idea of female choice and mate choice generally is a big part of evolutionary theory, so-called sexual selection. So thank you for that question. Why do you want equal reproductive value though? Fisher's argument doesn't answer that, correct? It only says males and females have equal reproductive value if you have 50-50. Yeah, so I guess the answer is, so reproductive value is basically how many grandchildren you're going to get. Let's turn that into genes. It's how many copies of the genes in me are going to get into that next generation, not my offspring, but the next generation. So if sons are more valuable than daughters, that means that the more copies of the genes are going to get in through them, and vice versa if daughters are more valuable. So a gene which blindly codes for a investment strategy which leads to greater numbers of copies of itself getting into future generations is going to be favored. Again, it's a blind process. That is the hard thing for people to grasp with evolution, is we are so used to thinking about the world being directed, where if you are religious, you think about God ultimately as controlling it. Even in society, we sort of think, oh, well, the leaders must be making all the decisions that make all of this work. And the truth is, it doesn't really work like that. I don't think the president of the United States or the president of China or Indonesia or India, with all due respect to them, is fully in control. The world is too complex. There are too many interactions and feedbacks. So the stability that we do see kind of emerges out of the chaos of interactions between individuals. And in the same way, the stability we see in the natural world, these organisms that look as though they've been designed, emerges from this blind process of differential survival because of differential ability to replicate, which is the core of evolution by natural selection. So I hope that sort of answers your question. I'll do a jump forward one. Jacob asked, why is there a dip in the graph for the hotter tank? Jacob, I think that's the reality, that with small sample sizes, things don't work perfectly. And I'm always very suspicious of anything that looks perfect, because the world is messy. And basically with small sample sizes, you don't expect things to go fit exactly with your predictions. Devesh asked exactly the same question. Thanks, Devesh. Same question. That's amazing. 2 people in a row. Who else do we have? Oh, we have so many questions still. All right, let's see. Okay, answer live. Do you have any industry jobs for evolutionists? That's an interesting question, because I realize that for many people it's, well, what job will I get at the end of this? What can I say? I have a job. My colleagues have jobs, and everyone that I have trained and has done a PhD with me has a job. They work in conservation, they work in government policy. Some of them are academics. Bob Wong, one of the people you saw at the beginning, Bob is an academic working in Melbourne. So industry, directly evolution, perhaps not. Of course, you're not going to be asked to sit around all day thinking about evolutionary theory, but the ideas you will learn are going to be very valuable. You can see this is kind of about economics. So you could do a really boring degree learning about microeconomics, or you could do a really fun one learning about how animals make strategic decisions about investing in sons and daughters, or deciding when to forage and when to try and mate. So there are opportunities there to take your knowledge and apply it to industry, I think is my answer.
Michael, there's a related question to that, which is asking what is the way in which we could apply this seemingly esoteric sex ratio theory to food production and possibly become a millionaire, I guess.
Oh, you guys want the millionaire answer? Let me see if I can find my slide. I'll tell you what, I'm going to call up one slide, how to be a millionaire. Can I do share screen? Where's it gone, Jay? Oh, there it is. Share screen. All right. Can you see a chicken there?
Yep.
All right. So, who wants to be a millionaire? If, as you may well know, when hens have chicks, half of them are male, half of them are female. We tend not to eat male chicks. We want females, big, fat, juicy chickens that can go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC, and be turned into food. We don't want males. So the production of males is incredibly wasteful from the industry's perspective. So how could you change the sex ratio? Is there any way? Now, one of the silly things that people will do is they would try and just say you get a bunch of females, some of them produce mainly daughters, some of them produce mainly sons. They say, oh, what we'll do is we'll only breed from the ones that are mainly producing daughters, right? And we'll put them into the next generation. That seems an obvious way. That's how people would do artificial selection, right? Like if you wanted to make a plant which had a higher oil content, each generation you select the plant that's got the most oil and you breed from it. And you do that for many generations, and then you end up with plants with more oil. this would not work, this logic, with the sex of your offspring, because if you are selecting for individuals that produce mainly daughters, there's still the natural selection there that anyone that produces sons is going to be very successful, because everyone's got a mom and a dad. Fisher condition. Everyone's got a mom and a dad. So that is not going to work. You need to do another trick. Now, I'm not going to tell you what I think the trick is. I don't know if it would work, but in principle, there is a way to bias the sex ratio so that you could get the production of more daughters than sons. And I'll give you a little clue. It is by changing the cost of sons and daughters to parents. If you change the cost, you should change the proportion of sons and daughters being produced. So what you need to work out is how to change the cost. Now, this is an evolutionary approach. It is possible there will be some genetic approach where you could shift the gene, the sex determination mechanism. But again, how are you going to do that when there's sexual reproduction? You're going to have to do it every generation. So no simple answers, but I do think in principle there's a way to do it by changing the costs of sons and daughters. Right. We've gone for an hour now. Jay, you still there?
Yes, I am, Michael. Up to you how many questions you want to take.
There are so many. Oh, all right. I'll tell you. I'll give you another one here. Jay, you need to tell me to stop, because I will be diligent and serve the university and carry on going until people stop watching.
I'll probably let you know when the attendees start dropping out at a pace.
All right. Okay. Shreya says, you mentioned species which produce about 90% male offspring. What is happening there? Okay, so I'll give you one example. There's a mite, a little mite that lives in the soil. Now, this is a very strange creature. What happens is the female gives birth inside herself. The babies don't pop out of her. She gives birth, and then her sons and daughters mate with each other. So basically they inbreed. There's inbreeding and incest occurring. And this is not uncommon in some species. Though in those situations, you get a very female biased operational sex ratio. This is not quite the answer. You said male biased. It's usually very female biased is what happens. So in this case, it's very female biased, because if you have only your own offspring mating with each other, how do you maximize the number of grandchildren? You don't need to produce lots of sons. You just need to produce enough sons to fertilize all your daughters. So basically, the more daughters you produce, the more descendants you get. So you only need to produce a few sons, fertilize all your daughters. So as a result, the sex ratio is very female biased. Male biased ones are usually when there's some benefit to producing sons. Like, for example, sons are more likely to help you rear offspring than daughters. In that case, there's a slight bias towards producing sons. So that's an example. What are the differences in the ratio due to COVID? Well, I guess COVID is, as far as I remember, and I'm not super up on this, leads to higher mortality in men than in women. So that will be affecting the adult sex ratio. But as you saw in that simple example I gave you, that is not going to affect the birth sex ratio, at least immediately. That requires some more complicated situations. So it should not lead to a change in the birth sex ratio if males die more than females. That was the example I gave you with the high mortality of sons relative to daughters. So you would not expect that on its own to change the birth sex ratio. Someone asked, is comparing the size of gametes the only way to understand which one is male female? I should be clear about this, because I as a biologist, I feel obliged and I want to defend the biological definition of sex. And it's not like understanding, it's just by definition, males produce small gametes, females produce big gametes. That's it. And of course, there are some species where the gametes are the same size. So many fungi, for example, like mushrooms, the sex cells are the same size. We don't talk about males and females then. We might talk about plus and minus, or strain A, B, C. Some fungi have 50, 100 different sexes. But that's unusual. But when you have two different size gametes, you only have two. You either have little and big. That's why it's so, it is, I'm sorry to say it, it is binary in that situation. It's either small gametes or large gametes. And for a biologist, that is the definition of male and female. Now, of course, this is extremely different from in humans, where we talk about gender and sexuality. And there, as a biologist, I don't have an opinion on that. People are free to choose to identify how they will. And I am perfectly comfortable with that. I have my my rainbow flag in the corner there. That's part of the wonder of human beings. But as a biologist, I have to stick to the definition of male and femaleness based on gamete size. Great, thanks for the question. All right. I might have to stop soon. Let's just take an arbitrary one. Maybe I'll answer this one. Can you explain from Praneeth? Can you explain the molecular mechanism of the sex allocation in the example of kakapo birds? The short answer to that is no. I don't know how it happens. We don't know how parents have the ability to bias the sex ratio. We simply know that they seem to be able to do it. So it's a challenge to know how. Yeah, it's a genuine challenge, but they seem to have the ability. So sometimes people joke that this kind of evolutionary biology is black box. You don't know how it happens, you're just able to predict what will happen based on theory. And I sort of see the details of how it happens as well. There's 100 ways you can do things, and that's not my main focus. It's like, I can make a prediction about, well, these kind of cars will go fast, these kind of cars will go slow, but I'm not so interested in how it's done underneath the hood of the car. I'm more interested in the question of why is the variation in the speed of cars. Not probably the most satisfying answer for you, but that's kind of the way I think about that. All right, Jay.
Michael, thank you. There's very quickly, we've got many more questions, but one of the comments, or perhaps a question, was, are you okay if people look you up on Google, find you on the ANU website, and get in touch with you if they're interested in the work that you and your group do, have any questions, want to interact with you?
Sure. Yes. Just to let people, yeah, absolutely. But I just have to be very clear to people. There's 148 people there now. If 20 of you do that, 5 minutes with each of you is 100 minutes. That's it's almost 2 hours. And I have many other responsibilities, but absolutely, I will try, and maybe I could bundle together a bunch of people and say, if you want to do a small Zoom meeting at some point. But you'll have to be a little bit patient with me. It's a busy time of year. I have to now go and mark exam scripts after this.
And look, thank you very much, Michael. That was a fascinating talk, and I thank you on behalf of all those attending today. And yeah, thank you for giving up your time, sharing your knowledge. It was a very fascinating talk. Those attending, thank you for coming and joining us. Thank you for the questions. And there are a few more. Those that are interested in biology, there are a few more talks definitely 2 talks from the other heads of department in our Research School of Biology that are coming up later this month. So hopefully we'll see you then. So thank you once again. Have a good evening, good day, wherever you are. And yeah, thank you again, Michael.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. It was lovely to have you here and to see all the questions. And I hope I've given you an insight into a slightly different way of doing biology than, say, standard molecular biology. So, all right.
Great.